松田学です。今回はですね、放射線の問題について、日本では東日本大震災、ちょうど10年前に起こりました。その3月11日ですね、近づいています。まだ福島の復興と東北の被災地、大変な状況が続いていますけれども、この福島の原発に関してですね、今回は世界を代表する放射線の専門家であるアリソンさん、今イギリスの方とですね、Zoom で今つながっておりますので、インタビューをしながらですね、この問題をどういうふうに考えていったらいいか、2回に分けて、皆さんにお届けしたいと思います。ちなみにこの番組の企画はですね、放射線の正しい知識を普及する研究会というところ、事務局長の高山三平さんの方からですね、依頼がありました。この正しい知識ということで、皆さんもお聞きになるとびっくりするような話が出てくるかもしれませんけれども、その内容については皆さん一人一人でご判断いただければと思います。それでは始めたいと思います。
Hello, I'm Wade Allison, Professor of Physics at Oxford University, recently retired, and I've researched and taught students all my life there for 40 years, motivated really by wanting to understand rather than building up political or contractual links of any kind. In 2006, I wrote a book called Fundamental Physics for Probing and Imaging, and it's a textbook. But as a result of writing that, I became very concerned that the way radiation is looked at in medicine and in health is a completely different level to the way it's looked at in the environment. And this difference has caused pointless suffering at Chernobyl at that time. So in 2009, I wrote another book, a popular book designed for everybody to be able to read, called Radiation and Reason, The Impact of Science on a Culture of Fear. And that was 2009, and that went very well. In 2011, of course, the Fukushima accident occurred, and unfortunately the mistakes of Chernobyl that I had written about were repeated, and very shortly after that, I'm glad to say, my book was translated and published in Japanese. And I visited and lectured in Japan in 2011 and 2013. I'm doing this because I have a very encouraging message to give to Japan and a lot of other people. And I'm often asked why nobody else is giving that same kind of message. But I'm aware that many people know what I'm saying, but are not able in a position to say it. But because I'm retired and have no political or commercial associations, and I'm a nuclear and medical physicist, I'm in a position to come to my own conclusions, not to rely over much on others and take things back to first principles. What I have to say is based on my own knowledge. They're my summary of the situation, and as such they're quite unrelated to any view of the British government or any commercial operation. I am a founder member of the SARI group, international SARI group of over 100 professionals who are worldwide, who are deeply concerned about the current misunderstanding and misuse of the science of nuclear radiation. And so they do have ideas very similar to mine. As well as shelter, food and water, civilization needs energy and mutual trust if it's to be able to support a sizable population. Both of these, energy and mutual trust, have been damaged by what happened at Fukushima in 2011, both as a result of official and reactions by the public. And this can't be justified in science. The choice of nuclear power is similar to similar advance made many years ago. When plants get energy, they get it from the sun, and animals get energy by eating food, and burning or digesting it inside. In a crucial step in the development of man on this planet, mankind started burning fuel outside his body. By studying fire, he learnt to control it and take it into his home. It gave immediate superiority over all the other animals, and it enabled him to cook and to heat his home and to live a much more comfortable and productive life. No doubt there were environmental protesters, and they were right, because fire is very dangerous and it costs many lives. Fortunately for civilization, those protesters lost the battle, and man continued to study nature and benefit from his findings. Today we have a new fire, nuclear energy, 1 million times more powerful than conventional fire, but very much safer. Unlike their predecessors, today's protesters are completely unjustified. They are simply wrong. Nuclear technology is quite safe, and the Fukushima accident has shown that. In March 2011, in Japan, there were 3 distinct events. The first was an exceptional natural disaster with massive destruction and nearly 20,000 lives lost. The second event was the resulting destruction of 3 nuclear reactors and the escape of an amount of radioactivity into the environment. However, this caused not a single death or even significant hospital admission. This was only an accident, it wasn't a disaster. And the third thing that happened was an artificial, self-inflicted, worldwide panic, which lasted over 3.5 years and has caused a loss of trust in society, a severe social stress, significant loss of life, over 1,000 deaths, great cost to the Japanese economy, massive increase in carbon emissions, all without benefit of any kind, except possibly to foreign fossil fuel providers. The excellent education and informative guidance about earthquakes given to Japanese children and citizens enabled them to optimize their reaction to the real disaster. It was amazing. It was brilliant. No other nation in the world would have been able to react to the tsunami, to the earthquake and tsunami, with the effectiveness that the Japanese people did, because they know about it. But when it came to the radiation, there was no knowledge, There was no experience, there were no plans, either by the authorities or the people, with disastrous results. This failure is not a Japanese problem, it was worldwide. The panic and lack of education in nuclear was something that every nation, each nation, reacted to with its own local historical terms. This complete misjudgment raises many questions. In physics, in reactors, in biology, in medicine, in sociology, economics, politics and philosophy. But here are just three. How safe is nuclear radiation? Secondly, how is it possible to build popular trust in nuclear safety? And thirdly, who still says that nuclear is very dangerous, and why? To talk about safety, we need to have numbers and measurements. These are the details that children and students should learn about in schools. Doses, energy, measured in energy absorbed per kilogram, that is in millisieverts, and radioactivity rates in becquerels. None of these things are difficult, but they're a bit tedious in an address like this. So we'll skip over the details here. As the data will confirm, it's actually the dose rate that is important. A dose, a radioactive dose, radiation dose, spread out in time to a low rate might as well not be there because of the evolved biological reaction, which has plenty of time to correct it. 2 points before we look at some data. The first is that nuclear is 70 years old, and in its medical applications it's 110 years old. So, although there are always technical advances and improvements to be made, it's not an immature technology. There is no need for special pleading of precaution, which certainly applies when you have a new technology where not as much is known. The second point I'd like to make is that we will concentrate on higher exposures of radiation to larger numbers of people. If these are shown to be safe, then data exposures, accidents with smaller numbers of people and smaller doses are not more unsafe. A radiation exposure may be either a single flash, like was emitted by the bomb at Hiroshima, or like you get from a dental X-ray on a different scale, a dental X-ray or a CT scan. Or it can be an ongoing chronic radiation, a dose rate from an internal radioactive source inside your body or from the natural background. Either of these, the ongoing and the acute, may cause, first of all, it might cause early death by widespread cell failure. This is called acute radiation syndrome. Or it can cause cancer in later years, which is what people often worry about. Or it might cause health failure in later generations, which they also worry about. Although notably, this has never been seen in humans and is only to be observed in Hollywood and in the pages of thrillers. So let's put that one out. There may also be, of course, non-fatal diseases, but statisticians find that death certificates provide a much more firm basis for concluding what's going on than looking at other marginal health conditions. There is sufficient mature evidence to study all of these, in particular from Chernobyl for an acute exposure, from the Goiânia accident, which I'm going to tell you about, for a chronic dose, then thirdly from lifelong cases of ingested radium, plutonium and other alpha emitters, and finally from a century of the use of radiation in clinical medicine for people's health. Moderate doses are used in diagnostic imaging, but doses typically 200 times larger are used to healthy parts of the body in radiotherapy. And all of these data, all of this information, has to be looked at and understood in the context of biology, that is, how life works. Life has evolved ways in which to protect itself from damage and cope with the damage if it occurs. That, after all, is what life is all about. In the context of radiation and other oxidative attack, its methods include neutralizing broken molecules, that is to say, hot radicals. You may have heard of antioxidants, that's what that is meant to be about, mending DNA breaks, replacing cells, and immunity, that is to say, rejecting any cell that doesn't look like one of ours. But this protection may be overwhelmed, it may not work, at high dose rates. And when it fails, what we need to know is what is the threshold for failure? At what dose rate does this natural protection fail? Let's look at the evidence. Let's look first at the Chernobyl data, in particular the Chernobyl firefighters who went in and put out the fire early on. They were irradiated very heavily in a day or two. The crosses on this slide show the mortality from ARS in each dose range. There is a clear threshold somewhere around 2000 millisieverts for such early death. The curve shows similar data for rats with many more examples, and what's important is perhaps that in the following 25 years after Chernobyl, some survivors died, but not necessarily, not of particularly radiation-related causes. As far as Hiroshima is concerned, early data on ARS are not available for obvious reasons. Studies show that most initial casualties died of blast and fire. The radiation was an acute flash from the bomb with little chronic dose. There was no evidence for later cancer deaths for doses below 100 to 200 millisieverts. Above that, there were leukemia and solid cancers. Next we come to the Goiânia incident. The Goiânia accident gives evidence for large internal doses with chronic effects spread out over months and years. In Brazil, a redundant radiotherapy dose, 50 million becquerels, to put that in, of cesium-137. Cesium-137 is the same isotope as escaped at Fukushima, and therefore this is particularly important. Anyway, this source went into a family home. The children enjoyed the blue glow that it emitted. They painted their skin. They got it in the kitchen and food. They invited in the neighbours to look at this extraordinary thing. They sold it to somebody else, and then some became ill. 249 of them were contaminated, and in 6 weeks, 4 of them died of acute radiation syndrome, like the people at Chernobyl. And the activity they had inside them was 100 million becquerels. 28 had surgery for burns on their arms and legs and so on, but survived. One woman with an activity of 200,000 becquerels was already 4 months pregnant, but she had a healthy but radioactive child. Another with an activity of 300 million becquerels, that is to say more activity than some of those who did die, became pregnant 3 years and 8 months later, but also had a healthy child. In the 25 years since the accident, there have been no further deaths that are considered likely to be related to radiation. Of course, some people died, but not of cancer. But there are professional reports of radiation-induced fear and stress, just as there were at Chernobyl and Fukushima. If there were time, I could look at data on radium and radon and plutonium and other alpha emitters. These are absorbed in rather slightly different ways, but it's still true that a threshold of about 1 gray, that is to say more than 1,000 millisieverts per year, is the threshold at which any fatalities or other diseases have been detected. As a matter of interest, in 1934, the year that Mary Curie died, the safety threshold was set at the equivalent of 730 millisieverts per year, almost exactly what I'm talking about. And I think one can say that it has only been changed, and it has been changed by a large factor, it's only been changed subsequently for political and other non-scientific reasons. I'm going to talk to you about medical doses. And it's important to realize that there has been amazing progress over the years, particularly in medical care in Japan and USA, Germany, and in other countries, based in large part on the work of Mary Curie and others. And to note that a diagnostic scan dose, that is to say from CT or SPECT or PET or the other kinds of radiation doses that you can get, is less than 1% of what you get from a radiotherapy course. And a course of radiotherapy uses a very large dose on members of the public to kill a tumour on purpose. That's what it's for. But the dose received by the tissue round the tumour may be half as much as the tumour itself receives. So that's also very high. That is 15 times, over a period of a month, 15 times what the workers at Chernobyl found to be fatal. But it's spread over 4 to 6 weeks. Every day, more tumour cells die, and every day in the treatment, healthy cells just manage to not die and recover. The standard safety criterion that the radiation dose should be kept as low as reasonably achievable, ALARA as it's called, ignores this recovery. Without this recovery, radiotherapy would be fatal. And millions of people all over the world have personal experience of the efficacy of this recovery mechanism for their own health. We can illustrate the position graphically with monthly doses represented by areas. Pictures are important even in science. The red circle is the fatal monthly dose to the tumour. The yellow is a dose tolerated by patients to healthy tissue with a few % chance of introducing a new cancer, a loss of hair, a burn, but usually recoverable, and usually the patients go away and say thank you. So this is not something hidden in some government nuclear research lab. This is something that a lot of people have a personal experience of. As high as relatively safe, AHA's level, is the green circle, conservatively 200 times smaller than the yellow one that we've just been talking about. There are no known risks at this dose rate, which is 100 millisieverts per month, and this is suggested as a conservative, safe threshold. If it had been used at Fukushima, there would have been no evacuation after the first couple of weeks, no food destruction, no social stress, no additional deaths, and so on. But it's 1,000 times the official UN-blessed standard ALARA rate, that is 1 millisievert per year, shown as the tiny area of the tiny black spot in the green one. The conclusion is that standard safety is unjustifiably strict by a factor of about 1,000, and great pain has been caused by its use in Fukushima, as it was also at Chernobyl.
まず最初の質問ですけれども、アリソンさんよろしくお願いします。まず原発と言いますとですね、日本の福島の原発事故の前に、チェルノブイリの事故とかスリーマイル島の事故が世界的に知られています。また放射線の問題、放射能の問題についてはですね、日本は被爆国として長崎、広島への原爆投下で悲惨な犠牲を強いられた、ということも人類史に残る出来事でありました。また大国による原爆実験というのがですね、相次いで行われてきたわけですが、自然環境にも大きな被害をもたらしてきたとされています。このようにですね、核技術に基づく放射能の被害がですね、人類共通の認識になっているわけなんですが、その中で放射能の危険性は考えられるほど大きくないとアリソン先生が実は主張されているんですけれども、そう簡単になかなか受け入れられないのではないかなというふうに思っています。で、ここで必要なのは科学的根拠に基づいて、これらの出来事が実際にどれぐらいの被害を人間に対して及ぼしてきたのか、あるいは及ぼしてこなかったのかですね、エビデンスに基づく説明だと思っています。で、そこでまずアリソンさんにお聞きしたいのはですね、これまでの大きな出来事の中で放射能が人体に大きな打撃を与えた場合というのはどのような場合であったのか、与えていなかった場合はどのような場合であったのかということなんですね。それは放射線の被爆量によるものではないかと思いますけれども、どのような場合には被爆量が危険なレベルに達していたのかということを知ることができればですね、私たちはどのような場合なら安心して原発に向き合えるかを知ることができると思います。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Please.
Please answer the question.
Thank you. perhaps after 10 years from Fukushima and more than 75 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we should be historians and look calmly at the evidence and not be, I think, horror and fear are not good for straight thinking. So perhaps we should look at the situation. Let's look at, it seems to me that the Japanese often put two things together, the tsunami and the nuclear accident. And the tsunami was very serious indeed, but there wasn't anything to do about it. And what was strange about the Fukushima accident was that nobody lost their lives from the radiation. That means, to me, there is something that we haven't understood, or maybe because I've been working on it for a long time, I hope that I did understand. Similarly, perhaps, and this is a question, does Japanese culture tend to put the horror of World War II and Hiroshima and Nagasaki together? Now, the bombing of Tokyo was terrible, and so was Berlin and Hamburg in Europe. But the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in fact no worse than Tokyo, I think. The numbers. Of course, at that time, with the horror, we thought that radiation was a big part of that, but it wasn't. We know now that it was the blast and the fire that killed 99% of the people. We thought perhaps that cancer and genetic damage afterwards would leave a long trail, not only of one generation, but to later generations. And now we know that the genetic inheritance doesn't happen with, like that, doesn't happen with humans. And the number of cancers in the 100,000 people from Hiroshima and Nagasaki whose health has been followed in the years since the Second World War, we know the number of extra people who died of cancer and leukemia. And it's not really very large. It's, as I say, like about 1%. So is the horror really right? Aren't there more horrible things? Shouldn't we be concentrating on possible horrors to come? Obviously, the present virus is telling us something, and we have climate change on the horizon, and we should look not at yesterday's horrors that we can't do anything about anyway, but the horrors that might come, because that's what we can do something about. So you mentioned the testing of bombs by the Soviet Union and the United States and others. That didn't actually cause any damaging effects. We thought at the time it might do, because we were told by the politicians that if you dropped 1,000 of these bombs, that would be 1,000 times worse, and that would be a problem. But the testing was not a problem by a factor of 1,000. So we have to, I think, to look at climate change, for instance, the extreme weather that it will bring, the deserts that will appear, the blackouts from loss of electricity supply, mass migration of people, water shortage. I think these are the horrible things that we should be talking about. So for the past 15 years, I have been writing and studying and speaking in Japan as well about the effects of radiation. What do we know? The best way to be sure about the effects of radiation, like for the virus, is to check between those who have been affected by radiation and those who haven't, like those who have had the vaccine and those who haven't, and you make the comparison. Now that's easy to do with laboratory animals. You can irradiate half of them and not irradiate the other half. Which ones die? Which ones get cancer? How long do they live? And all those experiments have been done, and we have learned a lot. Then there were the wild animals at Chernobyl, and also Fukushima also, but the study has been done. We can see on our television sets that the wild animals at Chernobyl in the evacuation zone, they're fine. They're much better now without those humans which caused them such trouble in the past. And they have the advantage of not having watched exciting stories on TV about the effects of radiation. So they're not frightened and they're fine. It's us who are frightened. We've frightened ourselves because it makes good television and exciting stories but rather like murder mysteries. It doesn't mean that murders happen all the time, and particularly in Japan, a very law-abiding society, that such things don't happen very much. We can look at people who live in regions with high natural radiation, places in Iran, southern India, and Brazil, where there's high natural radioactivity. Do they die of cancer? Well, they don't. At least not much. It's very hard to do to calculate it, and it's a very small effect indeed. Indeed, it is just as likely that they are better because life reacts to radiation, and if it gets a little bit of radiation, it increases its protection against radiation, and that is what has been happening since life began on Earth several thousand million years ago. So we react to radiation and like getting a vaccine, a little bit of contact with the problem, and our antibodies and protection mechanisms get better. And I'm not a biologist, but I've been following it for the last 15 years, talking to doctors and specialists, and I'm very impressed with the way biology works. It's beautiful, much better than any kind of regulation that mankind can put in place. I'm sorry, my clock is sounding. And then, of course, people do know about radiation. They get it in their medical clinics. Every time they go for a scan, or if they have cancer, radiotherapy to cure cancer. There are millions of people all over the world who have had longer lives as a result of radiation. It's positive. The name of Marie Curie, who was a leader in the understanding of the physics and chemistry of radiation, and radioactivity in the early days, and then its promotion in medicine is got Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry, and then has left us with a legacy of ideas about how to use it in medicine. What a wonderful thing. We should follow her. Of course, I could go on. I have written, since I was last in Japan, I have published another book, Nuclear is for Life. It's not the same as the first one, Radiation and Reason, but I think neither of them is available in Japan at the moment, and that's a pity. Of course, it is my opinion, but as a scientist, I have no involvement. I'm retired. I just say what the science evidence thinks.
Thank you very much. では次の質問ということで、今も福島のお話がありましたが、日本では福島事故からちょうど10年が経とうとしていまして、事故のですね、歴史的な意味と教訓の総括を行うという時点に至っています。国連報告で確かめられたとされているのがですね、福島の事故による放射線による死者は1人も出なかったと。でかえってですね、強制避難によって1500人以上の死者が出たということなんですが、なぜこうした事実が広く共有されていないのでしょうか。放射線の危険性が過大に評価されているというのはどうしてなのか教えていただけないでしょうか。
The problem is nobody learns anything when they're frightened. It's not a good time to understand something new. As a teacher, I know that I need my pupils to be quiet and at peace with themselves, and then to go away and study, and then they learn and understand new things. But there are other things that stop people learning, and one of those is jobs and investments. Now, people who have a job in the oil industry, they don't want to hear that oil is no good anymore. In fact, there is a beautiful quotation from an American journalist, which says, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it." You can't persuade people that it's what they're doing is not good for everybody else. And that applies not only in the fossil fuel industry, although that, of course, is being reconsidered, but it also applies in the radiation protection industry. There are people who have made their careers protecting people from radiation. There are United Nations committees. They do not vote for, oh, it's all right, there is no problem. So it is only people from outside who can see that something's wrong here. Why didn't people die of radiation at Fukushima? And the answer is that, as I say, that life has protected us, been protecting us from radiation for thousands of millions of years. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Only when the radiation is much, much greater than it is in the environment does the protection fail. And that is what happens when a cancerous tumor is given radiation, so much radiation that it can't protect itself and it dies. That is what happens in radiotherapy. Now, it can't say that we don't know about all this. It goes back to Mary Curie. It has been used in medicine for well over 100 years. So this is not something new. It's not something that we have to learn about because we didn't know it before. It's something we have to learn about because we didn't want to hear it before. So what worries me is that there are now people who are investing time and effort and money and careers in renewables. And renewables are weak and unreliable, and they didn't support mankind very well before the Industrial Revolution, and they can't possibly do so now. And those people are going in the wrong direction. So there is a three-way discussion between fossil fuels, and now at least I think people understand the problem there. Renewables, which are what used to happen before we used coal and oil, and they will not work. And then there is the bright new future of nuclear. And if people in jobs are frightened to think, at least young people in school and universities, they can sit and listen and think and understand. And old people like me can as well. So there is lots of hope, but we mustn't believe that just following what we learnt before and what we hear on television, well, from industries which want to maintain of course, maintain their investments. They are not necessarily the people we should listen to.
ありがとうございます。Thank you very much. ちょっと確認をしたいんですけれども、福島では強制避難とか除染とか、あるいは農産物の廃棄、いろんなことが行われてきたんですが、これは必要はなかったのかどうか、ちょっと確認したいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
In the end, the answer is yes, but one has to be a little bit careful. After an accident, nobody knows how big the accident is while it's still going on. So in the first few days, the people should be evacuated while you are measuring how bad the accident is and what has happened. Now, I followed the accident very, very closely and followed all the news that I could get. And on the 26th of March, 2011, I published a piece with the BBC, which they, on their World Service website. It's the only time the BBC have ever listened to what I had to say. And by then, 26th of March, it was already clear to me that the readings, the measurements of what had happened were not exact, but quite good enough, better than a factor of 10, to tell us that everybody then, before the end of March, should have gone back home again and got on with their lives while the industry cleaned up the mess at the power station. And that piece on the BBC is still available, of course, on the internet.
はい、ありがとうございます。これは少し人類社会全体の問題なんですが、放射線の危険性に対する課題評価っていうのはですね、どういう問題を人類全体にもたらしているのか、社会全体にもたらしているのかですね、これについてもちょっとお聞きしたい と思います。Please.
Well, much the most serious damage is the fact that whereas Japan had a large number of working, very satisfactory, perfectly safe nuclear power stations, it turned them all off. So the emissions, the carbon emissions over 10 years by a major society like Japan have been very damaging for the environment indeed. Now, there are countries that do not have enough nuclear power stations, but the ones that have them and are turning them off, as in Japan, but also in Germany, and in some places in the United States as well, this is very bad indeed. Of course, the mental health and social damage done to society in Japan by the fear of the radiation and being told that you have been irradiated and you have to leave home. And so this is very bad for families, for personal relationships, for children who can't told they may not go out to play, and their playground is dug up by officials in protective suits. This is about the worst thing that you could do to any society. Now, I'm not Japanese, and I know I can see that Japan is extremely resilient in the way that it handles some of these things, and that's a great deal of admiration. On the other hand, it was all unnecessary. But more than that, if you go into any hospital, there are a very large number of people in the hospital whose job is radiation protection. And not only do they protect from radiation, which they shouldn't need to do, but also the doctors are very careful not to give as much radiation as the medicine would suggest, so they could get a better picture of your inside, or do another scan, but they don't because it's dangerous. So we could be much more generous in our use of radiation in hospitals, and we wouldn't need to employ so many people because they could go off and teach people about radiation in schools, and we could save a lot of money in medicine. But that's much smaller than the effects of climate change.
ありがとうございます。先生と同じ認識の科学者の方々いらっしゃると思うんですけれども、この問題についてですね、どういうふうに考えて、世界中が誤った認識をしているということを正すために、具体的にどう行動しておられるのか、ちょっとお聞きしたいと思います。
Well, most of them are not taking action to rectify the situation because their jobs are in specialities that are nothing to do with radiation and nothing to do with nuclear power. So they have grants and funds and trusts for doing something else. Now, they may be personally interested to hear and to agree with me, but they're not able to do anything about it. The task is too big. There are no Nobel Prizes for the boy in the Hans Christian Andersen story of the Emperor's New Clothes, who pointed out that the emperor had no clothes on. There were no prizes for that. There were no funds. Everybody sticks in life with their fellow professionals, and everybody ends up by being not very well informed or not doing anything about it. But there are other problems. Most people, most doctors in medicine don't really know anything about nuclear. It's foreign territory to them, so they are cautious about it. Equally, people in nuclear physics know nothing about medicine, and so they're very cautious about that. So they don't say what I'm saying. Now, it just so happens that 20 years ago, I was in a similar situation, but I started a course in Oxford for the students on medical physics. And I found it extremely interesting. And I learned more and more, principally from my own students, which is the best way to learn. And as a result of that, I did stand across the barrier between medicine and physics. But I think this is not a criticism of Japan, because it applies equally well in the UK. We have educational systems which are over-specialized, so that we don't have people who are knowledgeable and confident, because it's not just knowledge, it's actually having the confidence to stand up and say something across barriers between them. And actually, from a technical point of view, all the most interesting things, developments, technological developments, are at the boundaries between one discipline and another. So it would be much wiser if our educational philosophy across the world was multidisciplinary. Deep, yes. Takes longer, yes. But we taught students more than one thing at a high degree level.
Thank you very much. どうもありがとうございます。今回はですね、この原子力あるいは放射線についてどういうふうに考えたらいいか、基本的な認識についてですね、アリソン先生に伺いました。この番組の前半の方でも動画でもご紹介していますが、それと合わせてですね、理解を深めていただければと思います。また第2回目、次回はですね、この基本的な認識を踏まえてですね、これからの課題といいますか、政策課題といいますか、それを中心にですね、聞いていきたいと思っていますので、次回もぜひお楽しみにしてください。どうもありがとうございました。